Hello, everyone. Welcome to Colonialism and Fracture on a Sunday. We're actually speaking when we got you, we're like Colonialism and Fracture on a Sunday. It's so serious. But thank you guys for joining us. I had the pleasure of reading these 3 wonderful books. Disclaimer. When we met, we had sort of like a 13-minute thing that you do before these panels start. I was like, should I read your bios? Because like, you've been doing this for like, it's the 3rd day now. Do you still want me to introduce you? And they were just like, no. So it's not my fault that I can't tell you how brilliant and wonderful the people that I'm sitting here with are. But I have asked them to start us off with a reading of the books, because 2 of the books that we're going to read or think and talk about today are fresh off the press. So congratulations. I think Lebogang, your one is like 3 months old. So we've got some new babies in the house. Just briefly, Siphiwe, Gloria, Ndlovu, Siphokazi Jonas, and Lebogang, Seale, everyone. Before we get into the series, I also sent everyone notes, and Lebogang before we started was just like, are you an academic? I'm Mapule Mohulatsi, and I'm a lecturer at UCT in the English department. And he was like, you must tone it down. It's students. So I'm going to try tone it down. But before we do, please read either your favorite segment or the opening of the book, and maybe give a brief description of what the book is about to people that haven't yet been able to read these beautiful texts. We'll go
okay, I'll start. Bless you.
Bless.
Don't apologize for bodily function.
You go.
You're safe here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Siphokazi Jonas. Thank you so much, Mapule. This is my debut collection, poetry collection. And it is, there's what the blurb says, on what this book is about, but I'm also learning it's about a lot more than that, especially at this festival, the sort of conversations we've been having. I think it is about, first of all, you should buy the book, and then you can, and then you can read, and then you tell me what you think it's about. But it is sort of a reflection on the impact of being a Model C learner in South Africa during the transition years of democracy. But it's also really not just about that reflection, it's actually finding language of how one leaves community, how one belongs or does not belong to community, thinking about tradition, religion, urban, rural space, so many things, like I said. So, but since we're talking about colonialism and fracture, let me read a poem, A Witch by Any Other Name. Oh, something that I think probably matters is that in terms of form, it is...
We're gonna
all right. A Witch by Any Other Name. Epigraph. It would be wrong if fat white people overseas get slim, thanks to us, while our children go hungry and uneducated. Magdalena Kasi. Walumgele amagqwirha. Throw hair trimmings into the street and they will bewitch you. Sisi doesn't say this loudly enough for mother to chastise her. Singamaqoboka. Fear sprouts, imagining a witch woman with face like zinc extracting my name from my follicles over a 3-legged pot. British witches, officials, beheaded Uhinzaka Kawuta, stole his ears and teeth as souvenirs. Traditional healers agree umbuso onikela ngamalungu emizimba eyezeni unqula ebingelelweni wobugqwirha. In the Kalahari, a San Gaicha points out plants conserved by scientists. He can no longer gather and use them as his ancestors taught without going to jail. Walumgele amagqwirha. Bring ancient knowledge to light and they will bewitch you. The Council for Scientific and Industrial Research and 2 foreign pharmaceuticals are Macbeth's 3 hags in lab coats and suits. attempting to divine weight loss properties out of Hoodia and patent it for commercial gain. Science. Jagalashe jagalashe ndophule ndiyacha. CC saying, refuse further dismemberment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Siphokazi. Thank you.
I don't think either one of us wants to follow that, so we'll go right. Who's next? Thank you so much for being here. So my novel, this is my fourth novel, The Creation of Half-Broken People. It is about an anonymous woman. She never is named until the very end, and she gives herself her name. She isn't hardly ever described until the very end again, but she is haunted through most of her life by three women, and she doesn't understand why. And because she sees these visions, she is diagnosed as being schizophrenic. And so most of the novel is her understanding what these women mean to her, and her own history and her own genealogy. So I'll just start reading from the very beginning. Okay, here we go. There was a time before this. I did not always live in the attic. There were moments in my childhood that were happy, and there were moments in my childhood that were not happy. Somewhere in between, I lost my name, but there will be time to tell of this later. What matters now is that I left that childhood with its moments of happiness and moments of unhappiness in the old country, when my mother took me to live with her in the new country. Without that journey to the new country, my life would have never taken the turn that led me to John B. Good IX. I was 21 years old when I met him, and it is because of that meeting that I'm here now. I had had 5 relationships by then, one relationship ending seamlessly blending into another's beginning. And because of this, because of the ease of transition, I felt worldly enough to enter into a relationship with the man almost 10 years my senior. I was on a Fulata scholarship, successfully finishing my last year of university when I received an invitation from the Good Foundation to what they called a Futures event. I knew that by Futures, the Good Foundation meant an opportunity to work for them, an internship that would hopefully turn into an entry-level position at the Good Foundation seemed like the best, if not obvious, way forward for a Fulata scholar. And so I attended the event with the foundation, which the foundation had invited all its current scholarship recipients, securing the knowledge that previous Fulata scholars had used it as a stepping stone towards positions of power and influence the world over. Although our families had once been connected, it had never occurred to me that I would one day meet John B. Good IX in person. He was a world-renowned photojournalist, had won 2 extremely prestigious awards before the age of 30, had been on the cover of Time magazine at 25, and his most lauded photograph, that of a man who had just been shot by a child soldier, reaching his hand out towards his killer, had been on the cover of Third World News Today. Everyone seemed to appreciate the way the photographer had been able to capture that moment, capture both supplication and forgiveness in that moment, that one gesture. I'll end there. But it's important to know that the novel is very much in conversation with Haggard's King Solomon's Mines. And so the John B. Goods are descendants of John Good in that novel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Good to see you, everyone. I noted that some of the people who attended the session that I had yesterday afternoon are here, and then also during the production last night, some of the people are here. So thank you so much for making time to be here. And then, as I indicated yesterday, okay, so 100 years of dispossession, my family's quest to reclaim our land. The setting of the book, as I indicated yesterday, is in Limpopo, in the near the scenic, beautiful town of Zaning. Most of you will know the place called Mahuba's Kloof. So on the foothills there, That's the setting. And then many of you will also know the farmer, one of the most powerful farmers in this country, known as ZZ2, Betty van Seale, those bright yellow tomato boxes that you find in most supermarkets. So he owns one of the pieces of land there, portion of land. And yesterday I already read 2 passages from the book, actually from my own writings. So today I will try to be slightly different and read a passage by the former Deputy Chief Justice, Dikgang Moseneke, who did a foreword just to be different from yesterday. So here we go. Right. 30 years have passed since the onset of the laws directed at restoring dispossessed land or other equitable redress. It is thus a good time to turn to lived experiences of people and communities who were, in many instances, continue to be victims of historical dispossession. That is what 100 years of dispossession does, in an elegant and timely but haunting account of the impediments to land reclamation faced by many powerless communities up to this day. Many, if not all, the obstacles are homegrown and self-inflicted. As they say, they are horrific own goals. The impediments to land restitution have only a marginal connection with the original sin of wholesale displacement of Aboriginal people from their ancestral lands of birth. This book must be read to uncover the remarkable lack of will on the part of the government and its inept bureaucratic arrangements. The author tells one how little land restitution officials care, how little they do, how little they are held to account, and how little they will be able to show by way of land restitution goals. Much money has flowed. The book alerts us, but there is so little to show for it on land restitution. The high ideals of our revolution towards pervasive restoration of birthrights to land and reconnection of native people to their confiscated land, and the goodness that must follow have now faltered. And yet, words like 100 years of dispossession, which must be read by all, will hopefully rekindle the flame of the Jewish quest for that primal goal of land restoration and justice, side by side with all other important fundamental entitlements due to all people of our country.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I thought these books were very fascinating, and I think if whoever sort of like puts the program of the open book does a very wonderful book of curating, because I particularly enjoyed reading them together, right? And I sort of like, they were very separate in a lot of ways, but also together, especially in the ways in which sort of like the colonial conquest, which we speak about over and over and over again, is sort of like both personal and public. We use those terms a lot of the times, that it's but I enjoyed the non-linear and multi-generational nature in which sort of like hundreds and centuries worth of histories are sort of like navigated, and in a very serious way, like we are now, but also in a very jocular and in a very genre-bending and form-experimenting nature. So when you read these texts, Siphokazi's poetry collection is sort of like narrating this oral story, right? And we sort of like get these interventions of poetry. And sometimes it's your narrative voice, and sometimes you invite the we. Siphiwe was about to speak now sort of like about the real and the unreal, so real life histories that we know and that are sort of like these grand narratives of colonial conquest are also just navigated in a way that makes them more personal. So I want you to please speak to me. I don't know if we can have two of you. Actually, speak to me sort of like about, or all of you, and just sort of like, was the genre-bending nature of these books, and also the intertextuality. Siphiwe, you invite a lot of Jane Eyre, Toni Morrison's Beloved, Rebecca, these Victorian Gothic famous novels are sort of like that genre subverted, and we get this African Gothic novel, right, which is an interesting and fascinating genre. And Siphokazi, you sort of like work with Shakespeare's The Tempest, and the character of Prospero sort of like invited in very Africanist ways. And Lebogang does this thing of he'll speak to Plaiki, he'll speak to Doris Lessing, he'll speak also to, you know, judicial and legislature. So how is the intertextuality and how the genre bending invited, especially because especially in the ways in which the characters and forms in the Western canon are invited and Africanized, and how did you get there?
I think it's a very important post-colonial project.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any other way to deal with the past, but you know, to interrogate it and engage with it, right? And so I think a lot of what is in, it sounds like in our works, is sort of like that colonial inheritance through education, right?
Yeah.
So these are things that we read. These are things that we have to contend with, and then these are things that we also have to make our own.
The
in some
material,
way. Yeah. And so for me, those very colonial texts are very personal, right? So when Haggard is writing about the Kukwana, he's writing about my people, the Matebele, and I have to come to understand that that's actually a reflection of how he sees us.
Yeah.
And then what do I do about that as a writer 100 and something years later? Like, how do I respond to that? And so I think a lot of that conversation just never ends, right? We're always in that moment of conversing with what happened in order both to understand the past, understand the present, and hopefully imagine this future where these things are metabolized and we have sort of like dealt with them, because I feel like we're still in the process of dealing.
Definitely, it's sort of like reading and rereading, and then, you know, sort of like reading as sort of like this reflective exercise, right? Sort of like you read from here, and then you also read from there, and then but as you're doing this rereading practices, you are organizing sort of like events in history in ways that sort of like change this grand narrative. Siphokazi, you also have a lot to say about education, and so do you, Lebogang. You sort of like speak about how it's both education is this freeing thing, but also that's not. And is your answer similar to Siphiwe in terms of like working with this huge archival history as an educated person?
I think my instinct was beef. Like,
Which was that?
I got beef with how Shakespeare has been taught in South Africa. This beef run, like it's long running beef with this old dead man. But if he even existed, a whole other conversation. But you know, I was thinking actually about, because we spoke a little bit about how I managed to escape the academy before it got me. And there are ways in which in my own research I couldn't quite push back the way I wanted to. And so there were all these systems in place to prevent that, and in order to pass. So when I had the creativity now to be able to just write my own work, those questions have been lingering in being a subject of English education in South Africa. And then who went on to study English Lit at university and so on. So I was like, torture me some more. So I think the beef was also in thinking about, and the literature has probably advanced a lot at this stage on this, but I was thinking about this positioning of the black child as Caliban in the Model C education. But then I was rereading The Tempest a couple of times while I was listening to Insomi, recordings of Insomi for like weeks on end from decades ago. So this is kind of, it's who I am. So it's my formation that has allowed for this kind of intertextual play and so on. But it was like, I was like, no man, like Prospero. I was like, Prospero stole this island. Like I've always known, but this, I was like, I don't want this positioning as Caliban. Yes, reusing the language to like fight the master with his own tools. But I was like, you know what? How can I mess with Shakespeare? That's always my question. And then in relation to Ndlovu, so casting him as that villainous figure. Oh, I'm spoiling it, Betuna, sorry. Like, it's a poetry collection. I don't know how much spoilers I can really say there are. But it was a sense of saying, what happens when I cast Prospero as a cannibalistic vulture?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then thinking about my experience of English, of education in South Africa. I just want to read a very short extract, I think, on the island. So when Olinde Gutiwa arrives on the island.
And the island is also quite an interesting site because it's in itself is sort of like a fractured space, right? It's not this like together, just get carried away. But
Yeah. That evening, so they've just arrived on the island. That evening, there was a ceremony to welcome the children to the island. They stood in rows as the king of Amaqalanga, Prospero, arrived at the banquet. He was taller than the tallest man Olinde Gutiwa had ever seen, and his wings were as wide as the widest hut. If only her best friend could have come with her to see these wonders. After the most delicious supper they had ever eaten, the children were then brought to Prospero's perch. He offered each child a berry to eat, then plucked their tongues out of their mouths. He would then give them a new name to stop the bleeding. One child followed another until eventually it was her turn. No longer called Olinde Gutiwa, named one, celebrated her new name, even as she struggled to pronounce it. So the sense of like, yeah.
Right. No, thank you. I mean, you're asking about the question regarding the liberating power of education. But before I reflect on that, I just wanted to also briefly talk about issues of colonialism and fracture. When I look at my book, it is located, within the theme of colonialism itself. And it's important, obviously, to recognize that, colonialism might have largely ended, but it still lingers on. But in writing this book, I've had to draw on the work of foremost African authors who have written extensively on this issue. Your Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Saul Plaatje, Doris Lesson, as you have said, and there's been many valuable lessons that I've learned and that helped me in crafting this book as well. But now, on the question of education that you're asking specifically, I mean, on a personal level, as I reflect in the book, on the farm that we grew up, there was absolutely no school, no creche, nothing. So as young children growing up on that farm, we were left in the limbo. And what we did, all we could do in the morning, sometimes we'll go to the main shed where some of our parents worked. So there was a main road where a combi ferrying white children to the nearest town to school every morning. So we'll wake up and stand there, wait for them as they come on their way to school, and then we will all be waving them. You know, when we're just young children. And then if they waved back, then we'll all be elated and then clapping just because they waved back at us. And if they didn't wave back, so the one who was waving the most will be held to ridicule and will be laughing at those ones. So those kind of things. But then there came a time when I was shipped to the nearest village where I could start school. That was my maternal grandparents. But when I got there, I found that the education that was not, what was later as I found out, the education was not really liberating because it was based on colonial assumptions. So what it did, it was kind of identity deformation and cultural alienating kind of education. So identity deformation and culturally alienating for me because I didn't identify with that type of education. So what the education sought to do was to create a group of natives, one will say that were African in blood, but European in, what I would say in taste, I would say in speech, I would say also European in the way that you carried yourself.
Definitely.
So, which was very confusing. So, I wouldn't say it was liberating, but we had to toil on. Only now, when you reflect back, do you realize what you were put through in that system of education?
I enjoy that what you're saying, because there was that running idea in these books, reading them together, that education is sort of like this liberatory thing, but it's also sort of like in itself capturer, right? But knowledge, on the other hand, is navigated in different ways, right? So there's sort of like ways of knowing. And I like sort of like how these ways of knowing, because we usually, when we think of colonialism and fracture, we want to invite, Mother Africa, that torture trope, of the all-knowing mother, the storyteller, and all those things. And we did get that sense of oral history, but we got it, and all these books share this very spiced notion of the problematized mother, not only through the oral tale, but also the mother as sort of like a recorder of history. Our unnamed protagonist, for example, has a very snacks, ugly, not so nice relationship in the creation of broken people. Sort of like has a very not so nice relationship with the mother. And Siphokazi, in your novel, we sort of like, not novel, like story/poetry collection, we get the story of a mother and sort of like a child journey happening. But also in these poems, we don't meet nice women all the time. When I read Sweet Blood, I was like, that is spicy as hell. And Lebogang, I really loved your mother, because Lebogang's book opens with his mother. She's missing. And then he's just gotten home for the Christmas holidays, and she comes back, and she's from a funeral, but she's from a funeral of someone who's sort of like an abuser. Can I use that word? Colonizer, abuser. And the family's like, why are you mourning this person? He's a bully. You're right. And he's just like, no, he's not. And she speaks about how she loves sort of like this Boer family. So I really enjoyed the problematized mother, and sort of like how the female figure in these texts is not read through this Mother Africa trope that's so tired of an all-giving, untiring a mother. And I sort of like would like to speak more about these mother figures and how they speak to this theme of colonialism and fracture.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just weigh in on that, in typically African tradition in particular, the mother is more of the institution of motherhood itself is seen as a nation state.
Yeah.
As somebody who embodies the ideal and best moral and ethical practices. And then, however, it's also a cultural thing that you must conform to certain practices. So it comes in forms and shapes that women have to adapt to and conform to certain cultural expectations. Now, and you have to sacrifice something, you lose your autonomy in the process as a woman, because you are expected to conform to, at least from an African perspective. Right. Now, yes, my mother, we have claimed this land. Okay, she had been to that land as well. She worked there, she toiled and all of that. But my mom believes that the whites love her. And then she's so fond of them. So the book opens with her coming from a funeral of this farmer who had died. And then she didn't tell anyone. So we all wondering where she is, only for her to come late in the afternoon, much to our consternation. Why are you doing this? Because she always questions us, why are you, leave the farmers alone. Just leave them alone. What do you know about land? Other communities have accepted financial compensation, money, but you still don't have your land because you don't want to accept the money. So you are foolish in that. So that is my mom, but also it worries us as a family because she was a very powerful woman. She had this unbearing thing about her. She would routinely be sending, whenever there were ceremonies in the family, she would be routinely be sending people on errands. In fact, she would even tell you that if I had been to school, I would have been the president. And then because of her influence, she goes about telling people that they are foolish. They still don't have their land because they don't want to accept money. So those kind of things.
Yeah. And Siphiwe, the mother is quite a powerful figure in you. The problematized mother is quite a, yeah.
I think for me, it's just womanhood and negotiating womanhood in general. And I think what Lebogang just said is also very important, that there's this coming together of these two ideas of womanhood, right? The traditional African good woman that he's just stated, and then sort of like the colonial good woman, right? And so as a black woman, you're having to negotiate these two things that don't always gel, because you're not, for the colonial narrative, you're not a good woman, right? And yet you have to be a good woman. And so I wanted to trace this genealogy that is already problematic, this idea that womanhood is attached to motherhood, and that's what makes a woman good, is that she's a mother. And that's what makes her get remembered, is that she had children. So it's not necessarily that she did anything great beyond that, is that she had children. And so there's this constant struggle with a lot of the women in my text around this idea of having to bear children in order to be remembered. And then what happens when you choose other things, when you choose otherwise from these true traditions. And I think we have a character. And so what I liked about what you said about, colonialism coming and saying, our education saying, and this is both in colonial times and right now. I'm sure there's a child going through this and saying this education is actually splitting me, right? It's making me both myself and then this other thing, and I'm having to negotiate constantly. And it's sad that it continues, even though we have the language from the Nguki wa Tiongo saying, this is what's happening, we need to decolonize the mind, and yet we keep repeating this. So that's a whole other conversation. But I think it's important for me to go back to what you're saying about the splits. This is where the title comes from in the archives, is sort of like this very colonial figure is describing middle-class black people as half-broken because they're both traditional and westernized, and so they're half-broken. And for me, the whole argument is that, well, everyone who's part of the colonial enterprise is half-broken.
Yeah, we're all these mishmashed. Thank you so much. We're all these pieces, broken pieces, mishmashed. And I guess this also speaks to the genre-bending nature, right? These pieces that are put together to make sense of this history. Maybe you can read us the recipe or Sweet Blood poem.
Okay, so
any one of the two. Okay, maybe the recipe one is Sula. Hit us with Sweet Blood.
All right. Let's read Sweet Blood. I'm actually fascinated by the connections.
Yeah, it's reading them
happening
together,
here.
these books, honestly.
Wow.
I hope you also do that exercise. It's fascinating because it's like this is a project on its own, what these books are doing.
Because also an unnamed character, like the protagonist has no name.
Yes, your character is also
Beautiful. So get all 3 books. Sweet blood is the superstition her parents provide when mosquitoes prey on her torso. Everyone else undisturbed on the veranda. Doors and windows slack-mouthed, house expelling heat from each room. Sweet blood on white sheets in Lisbon. Bed bugs dot her limbs into pointillist landscape. 14 hours away from home remedies. Father's Vicks to draw the sting out. Mother's calamine lotion to cool the itch. Sweet blood stains the blade of Leviticus 15 verse 19. Separates her love from her teenage body. The older woman is a mosquito transmitting shame through her own infected body, cleansed with communion wine.
And maybe I'll just give us 2 more provocations, and then at like 1:45 we'll open to questions so that we're not hogging the mic. But I also, when reading these books together, right, and I think everything that I've read, it is sort of like connected to this genre-bending nature. I felt that there was not only the translation of language. I think it's you, Siphokazi, who provides us with a glossary at the end. Lebogang doesn't use italics all the time. So you also don't use italics all the time when you're sort of like translating African language. So there's also that just refusal to translate in the text, or because you don't translate everything as you provide a glossary. But there's also the translation of spaces, and some of these spaces sort of like this, the ancestral, element of and how space, right, and colonial space, sort of like space that sort of like is appropriated because of the colonial encounter, also becomes translated, but the sort of like notion of an ancestral spirit to place. I think S.K.M. Patlele calls it sort of like every place has its sound, right? And there's that navigation of translations of spaces. And in your books in Siphiwe, I felt like there were unbreathable and claustrophobic spaces, but there were also spaces that are mentally and spiritually read and rendered as, these sounded. Like there was a sonic ancestral element. And it's not just, so it was about land, right? But in a lot of time it was about occupying different spaces of different sizes. But it was also, I felt more about how sort of like histories are embodied and translated through time by the people that carry these histories. So can we speak about sort of like these ghostly presences and translation of spaces? Sorry, I'm failing at toning it down in your text.
So for me, I think the idea of place is important because the City of Kings is for me the place that contains with it a sense of belonging, right, and a sense of family for the narrator, but I think in all the novels that I write, for the characters in those novels. But also I feel like what I love about the City of Kings is that it is an unsettled place.
Yes.
And it is in many ways unsettling. And for me, that is just its history, right? It's both this coming together of people. And so the women that the narrator sees, because of the history of this part of the world, should not be connected. So she sees visions of a black woman, a colored woman, and a white woman. And because of our history, she cannot connect them, right? Because these women cannot have a relationship. Apparently. And so it's when she delves into the history of this place that she sees the connection. And as most of you know who have read any of the novels, that the City of Kings itself is based on Bulawayo, which is this, for me, this wonderful cosmopolitan place that brings together different people at the turn of the last century to create a very cosmopolitan space in terms of ethnicity and race and all kinds of things. And so it is a very contentious history because of that, right? It is a history of people constantly moving because of the labor market, because of genocide, because of all kinds of different things. So it's always this migration back and forth. And so a lot gets lost because, as you heard when I read, they were already moving at the beginning. They moved from the old country to the new, and they don't carry the history because there's been a break. And for me, it's like, how do you connect back to those ancestral beings when your entire education, when your entire systems are saying there is no connection between you and there's no relation? And so it's this work that we have to do, I think. And for me, it is very much grounded in the place that I come from, in understanding that complex history and understanding what I've inherited from
it,
history.
definitely.
Yeah, thank you. So in my book, I reflect on how I used to grapple with the fact that on the farms, it's vast. stretching as far as the eye can see, areas of land, and then dotted with farmhouses. One here, one over there, scattered, far apart from each other. Then there are electric poles running towards one house on a mountain and another there. And then there are villages that are cramped. And when we were forced off the farm, and when we go to the villages, it was said that people from the farms can only stay in this section of the village. And then in that particular section, we were not allowed to breed livestock. But then, again, the livestock from the other section roomed our own spaces. And then it was said that because they used these derogatory terms, fellow black people there, that we were magompo, like uncivilized people from the farms. So it was another form of, I don't know, re-inflicting or recolonization, or I don't know what to call it, but they were using all these derogatory terms to describe us. So now you have the farms. Now I move to the urban areas. In the urban areas, you'll find the urban ghetto and the squalor there. And the spaces are so limited. And then we see it here in Cape Town, we see it in Joburg as well. So the spaces are so limited that they are so stifling to those people. And people live on top of each other, quite literally and figuratively. And then the jostling for the few resources and all those competing interests that breed conflict and tensions within communities. So I grapple with those kind of things. And then as they are cramped there, then they are separated by high walls. And then who owns the property on the other side? So these are the type of things that I talk about when I say colonialism might have largely ended, but it lingers on. But not just that only. I mean, it also alters the essence of our identity and existence in a way. So the implications are far-reaching. And then, as I indicated yesterday, I may look fine and well, but I carry deep scars of colonialism. These scars are refusing to heal in me. When you look at me, I look well and sane and fine, but I carry these scars because I grew up on these farms. I worked on these farms. School holidays, you were expected to go and work there, and you experience this type of exploitation. You get there, you have your everything. They give you this thing they say is for you to get food, but you have not asked for it. Then they deduct. You know, there are just so many things to talk about, but all of it is in the book.
And do you feel like maybe to close off, and this is the last question, because these books are also very much concerned with restoration and justice, right? And justice not only in sort of like its judicial ways, but justice in sort of like, you sometimes feel like I don't need justice from the courts, but I need some sort of divine justice. Also, there's sort of like forms of justice that these books deal with. And at the end of reading them, I felt that like there was also the sense of justice probably is this far-flung dream, right? That it's this, that it becomes a sort of like a sort of utopia. And I don't know, when you finished reading or when you were doing the research, did you feel any sense of justice, or that you had done justice to, thinking about right and wrong and the ambiguities in between, especially because you guys complicate the victims and perpetrators? Did you feel like that sense of justice?
I'll just say very quickly that I think that is something that is a very individual thing.
Yeah.
I think if we try to make it so that those in power sort of like restore things to how they should be, then we'll be waiting forever. So I think it's important that works like this get written, that questions like this get interrogated, that this work happens. Because I think if you're waiting for it to happen, and I just think about how the land issue was dealt with in Zimbabwe, you know, and it just that was not, my people were still not where they're supposed to be
Yeah.
because, you know,
Absolutely.
greed again. And I remember when you were talking yesterday that greed and avarice just don't lead anywhere. And unfortunately, if that's what's at the head of the government and the state, then it's just going to repeat itself. So I think you do it on the ground in ways that you can, and then hopefully that builds.
I wasn't thinking about justice. I think it was an excavation and really thinking through the impact, and then so hopefully whatever. But it's also because I was thinking about what's lost primarily, but what's gained, and what's the reworking, what's the molding together. I'm going to quickly read. I'm still learning how to speak about this book. It came out last week. So I think, so because then you spend all this time writing and then it's out. And so it's like the conversation, there's ways of seeing it when you're sitting with your editor. Shout out to Vangile Kanjo. And having this conversation and then coming, with these questions that I'm like, these are also an interpretation of what it is that's on the page. So I just want to read Straining Cloth. After crucifying Ubukosabam, wounds dressed in school uniform, tongue bound for 6 hours to avoid detection and detention, then migrating home by bus to hydrate with ginger beer. I wish I'd asked the ground ginger dredged through a straining cloth how it felt to surrender the flavor of its body to a drink, then be discarded. Wars are won and lost with bodies. In former white schools, we were thorny as bones, securing victory for Athens, breaking the architect of apartheid's curse over Bantu education in exchange for new accents to finesse our way into white economy. Had I foreseen my excavation, a heap of ex-miners and domestic workers eroded to silicosis and arthritis, black employees code-switching daily, wounds dressed in traditional costume on Heritage Day, I would have been less annoyed by traces of ginger escaping a straining cloth to lurk at the bottom of my glass and in my throat. So I think it's... So I think it's that excavation of thinking about personal history, thinking about broader history, using this fantastical world of Inzomi to be able to do things that I wouldn't really be able to do if it was sort of an accurate historical account, because animals talk here. So it was for me. It's about that lingering, those lingerings that I'm really interested in.
That aftertaste that I think Siphiwe is also referring to. Justice.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because I wanted justice. I thought that through this book, the powers that be will be able to hear our cries, because this land claim dates back, 26 years. 1998, the first time communities could launch land claims. To date, nothing has happened, but what is the problem? It's not the white people who are now refusing to give back the land necessarily. In fact, some of the white people have come out and say, look, we can help because this thing is disruptive and we are not sure about investment and the future of our properties. We want clarity. But the government has just been dithering on this issue. As the Chief Justice, Dikgang Moseneke, the former Deputy Chief Justice, says in this book, horrific own goats.
Yes,
That is our
but so. Aye. Thank you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Maybe we should take 3 at a time, or do you guys want one each?
Depends on how complicated
3 at
they
a
are.
time. Yeah.
Hi. I think
Oh.
I thought someone else had the mic because you were looking in that direction. All right. Firstly, Siphokazi, I am going to get your book because it's specifically because of the first poem that you read, because it describes to me, I'm going to get the Xhosa translation somehow, but from what I understood, you are calling the very act of colonialism witchcraft, which I definitely believe it is, and I'm trying to find my ways to to think about that and think through that. But the question that I have, and any of the three of you can answer, is, you know, I was thinking and talking with someone about this idea of our being colonial projects, right? That that it's not a past thing, but it's an ongoing thing. The fact that Africans in Africa are still very much colonial projects, and when we think about our place in being colonial projects, then it kind of becomes, it looks a little bit bleak. The idea of decolonizing looks a little bit bleak. But I think, again, when I'll go back to you, Siphokazi, when you say it is witchcraft, do you think that that's maybe a start to thinking about moving into decolonization, like taking the project of decolonization seriously, just acknowledging firstly like how deep, how dark, and how evil and very witchy the colonial project is.
Should we take maybe two more and then we sort of like answer them in a bulk?
Hi, this is also for you. The line from your first poem, and I'm sorry if I butcher this, he cannot use these plants as his ancestors once did, or else he would be jailed. That just kind of lends me to beg the question, like, where do we draw the line between conservation of culture and conservation of nature? Because the dying of indigenous plants due to debarking is like a very real issue at the moment, and I'd just really like to hear your opinion on that.
Maybe last one for this round. There's some questions here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mapule, for bringing in the ancestral part of this conversation, right? So I'm going to draw back to my varsity years when Professor Lynette Steenfeld said to us, colonialism is the process through which we were colonized, and then there is coloniality, which are the fractures left of colonialism. So I'm going to make myself I'm going to draw from myself to create this question. I am going through what is called Ndlovu, right? So it is the becoming a healer by shedding off the last of you, like your old self, and embodying this new being to become a healer. So I like to look at South Africa as the old self, like the old South Africa as the old self, and the democratic South Africa as Itwasa, someone who's going through Lentwaso, but they're still at the stage where they've not yet accepted uvuma ukufa, right? And I think you'd understand this, Siphokazi, because I'm bringing this question because of your writing, how you are able to take in Tsomi, which is not something regarded as highly by the English, it's just folklore, right? But you take it and you give it this status in this book where you just, as Mapule said, you don't italicize, you just let it flow as part of it. But then there's this part of us as Black South Africans where the coloniality has removed so much of us. We are so fractured that we can't go back, right? Mm-hmm. We can't really reclaim who we are. How do we, I don't know, should I say as everyone, as Black people, how do we move forward with the broken pieces and create this flippant rainbow nation that doesn't exist? Because there's no rainbow.
Yeah, I think everyone is well equipped to answer.
I'm going to just jump on those two questions because I'm sort of slowly forgetting them. because good deep. So let me actually start with the conservation question. Yes. So I can't really help you. I write poems. But I think we need to go back, again, probably links to this conversation, in thinking why there's a need for that anyway. And if we think about extractionist culture, we're thinking about capitalism. The reason we need to be conserving is because of those things, right? So this is a conversation I had with a San traditional healer in the Kalahari, where he showed, and because remember, he's using these plants, he wants to use them for healing in his community. This is not, some big, so his issue was, there are definitely some plants he's able to grow, but he would say, these are things I grew up using for this community, to heal this community, and now because of conservation efforts, which I'm a big fan, but because of, these parameters that are set, as this is the whole scientific project, doesn't actually acknowledge why he's in that position. And also it's a community of maybe 20, 30 people, versus when the South African Council, those people I mentioned here, and they tried to steal and patent Hoodia, which is grown there, and which has been used by hunters, by sand hunters for generations, just to ease hunger so they can hunt and provide for the family. So you see the cycle is different, and they wanted to use it for weight loss medication. So then the community said, nope, not without us. And that was the fight. So there was a whole case, and that they actually won that you don't have rights without us, so this community must benefit. So I think the conversation around those two things needs to be within that context, and probably ask a scientist. So this is as far as I've gotten with that thinking. And then as for colonial witchcraft, there are actually footnotes in this poem for very specific reasons. There are no footnotes elsewhere, and I think all the spoken text, none of it is translated. It's only the terms and specific things in the narrative. But we believe, I have this belief that there's an evocation, a kind of incantation that happens because, a chant or a song actually moves the plot forward, and it changes certain things. So those are not translated. If you need translation, either learn isiXhosa or any Nguni language, make friends, find someone. But yes, so I won't even go into that. But I think that is a very, very big question. Decolonization is already, taken very, very seriously and has been for a very long time. I think there's that personal aspect of it. For me, that's what it was about. I don't have big questions for everyone. It's for me, it was my question of, as this fractured subject, so-called subject, what does that look like for me in relation to that very big thing? So it was also a sort of textual thing where something that's reduced to, we think, witchcraft, this is a backward African thing. And it was actually triggered by, there was a YouTube clip from Fees Must Fall days at UCT. A student, someone said, okay, but what is decolonization for science? And she said, if we're going to decolonize, let's start there, because, what is science from an African perspective? And she said, what about, lightning that can be sent from, I can't remember, she mentioned this place, and everyone, there was an uproar. What do you mean decolonize science? Science is infallible, it's objective. People lost their minds. And I was like, oh, really? Oh, really? And I wrote a poem saying, actually, colonization is witchcraft. Yes.
Yeah, so profound. And I think the two questions were, in a way, related. And then I think, at least from an historical point of view, it's important to understand that colonialism was intentional and deliberate. And one of the ways that it manifested itself was that the true identities of indigenous people had to be altered so that they can fit the colonial project. So it must fit that project. So our cultural values were fractured, were dismantled, crushed, and emptied,
Humanized.
so that we look like them. The French speak about what is called assimilation. So a group of black people that are taken there and they get assimilated into the French culture, then they come back home, and then they want to make more people look French and so forth. And then also with the other, European nations. So we are fractured. But also, there is another way to it. So one of the ways is to create myth and labels around that black people are inherently and unbearably lazy, economically speaking, so that only a certain group of people can do skilled work. And those tasks that require skills are for the colonizers.
Yeah.
So that justifies the slave-like conditions and the wages of sin. And today, how does that manifest itself? We see, like, often the use of foreign migrants to say South Africans are lazy.
Yeah.
Because it's part of the myth about black people that has been created, that we are unbearably lazy. And then also in many ways. Now, what must we do? I mean, it's a difficult question. I see that universities are also grappling as the centers of research, and then we should be busy with knowledge production, are also grappling with this issue of decolonization and decoloniality. There's no clear conviction of how they want to do it. People randomly quote Steve Biko. It's become fashionable.
Yeah.
But with no clear conviction. And even universities, even the university that I work for, they talk a lot about decolonization, but there's no clear conviction about it. So I think this thing is deep, it's cultural, it's psychological, it's emotional. What do we need? A reconstruction of the soul? or what? But I think there has to be researchers who delve deeper into the subject and what can we do to restore our human dignity, and so that we can serve our people in a just manner. Because what we see today is the emergence of African elite who are also oppressing us.
Yeah, yeah. On that note, there is a lot of work to be done. Thank you guys so much.